almost kidnapped in a ghost town. I never tell anyone this story, but reading all of the stories on here, I feel like I need to post about it. Because of this, I don't go on walks alone or even with friends unless it's in a very public place, but even then, I am paranoid. With that being said, my friend's family had just moved to a new town 15 minutes from where I lived. It was a complete ghost town, with one tiny grocery store, a post office, and a school. This town was so secluded and quiet, I rarely saw cars drive by. One night, as we were unpacking boxes, we heard a knock at the door. It was a big, tall man with a shotgun in his hands. Being from Oklahoma, this could mean you're either meeting your new hick neighbor, or it's actually someone wanting to harm us. Turns out, it was just a hick neighbor coming to introduce himself. He told my friend's mom about the lack of police, and how everyone tends to carry their own guns in order to protect themselves, because the police were usually no help, and 15 minutes away. He also talked about how these areas can be dangerous, and that my friend's mom should keep a gun with her. At this time, I was 13 years old, and knowing this information, you would think I would simply stay my ass inside and not wander the streets of this dangerous hillbilly ghost town. But I did. There was no service, no cable, and nothing to do but go outside. We would walk to the store and get snacks, walk to the school, and play on the playground. Majority of the time, we wouldn't see a single car or person, but the same clerk in the grocery store on every walk we took. There was a day my dad had brought me to her house, and right off the bat we walked to the park. That day, I was sick to my stomach, but was so eager to go see my friend that I went anyways. I had a terrible feeling, and now that I'm older and have experienced bad anxiety, I can now say that that day, I was experiencing some pretty bad anxiety, and I didn't know why I felt this way. When we got there, we actually ended up hanging out with an old friend who had transferred to this school a year prior. After he left, we sat on the bench for what felt like ages, taking selfies and talking, when all of a sudden, the stereotypical creepy van pulls up to the park. Now, my friend was, and still is, way braver than I was, and will ever be, and she was always the daredevil one in our friendship. But for some reason, around this time, I just assumed it was a family coming to play, and my anxiety was gone. But my friend was scared. She immediately had a bad feeling when the van pulled up, and I could tell she was ready to leave. But we decided to stay and see who it was before we just ran off. Of course, like something out of a movie, two big men came out literally barreling over to where we were. We immediately started to walk away, and they tried to follow and grab us. At this point, we began to run. They got back in the van and followed us. I have no idea how, but they didn't catch up to us. We ran as fast as we could up the road and straight to the grocery store. I was so horrified when we got inside I couldn't even speak. That sick feeling I felt on the way to my friend's house made complete sense. My mom was always watching true crime growing up, and sometimes she would have me watch with her, so I was always really scared to walk around because of that. But even with that fear, I never thought it would happen to me. The van was parked across the street, but eventually drove off. We walked home with no way to call anyone, thinking they could be waiting for us around every corner, with absolutely no one around. It was the scariest day of my life. I didn't tell anyone for years, which was stupid of me, but at 13 years old, I didn't know what to do. I'm turning 21 soon, and this story still keeps me up at night sometimes. I can't help but imagine what would have happened if they captured me and my friend, where we would have gone, and what would have happened to us. John, the job center stalker. When I was 18 and newly graduated, I ran into some issues with attempts to enroll in college, and also had a hard time finding a job in my area in the meantime, which led me to having to sign on to the job center. They determined that I was too shy to succeed in interviews, and placed me in a group that was supposed to teach interview skills in order to fix that. The group ended up ultimately being a complete waste of time. I honestly think they put me in the wrong group, or just needed an extra member, and made an excuse to throw me in to make up the numbers. But that's not really relevant to the story, and the other group members didn't do much to help with my shyness either. Since they were all men, who were at least 4 decades older than me, and obviously didn't share any of my interests. Unfortunately, I ended up gaining the attention of one member I wanted nothing to do with. I don't actually remember the man's name at this point, but I think it was something generic like John, so that's what I'll call him. John immediately got off on the wrong foot with the rest of the group when he interrupted the instructor during their introduction to the course to complain that him being there was useless, since he would be retiring in a few years anyways, and no one wanted to hire someone who had spent over 10 years in prison. When that didn't get him the reaction he wanted, I assumed the rest of the group thought he was just attention-seeking, and the instructor had heard similar things before from people who weren't happy about being in the course. He waited until we had been given paperwork to complete, and then turned to the man next to him and loudly explained his prison sentence was for beating his ex-wife, but that she was a lying bitch, and he never put a hand on her. She didn't even have any bruises on her at the trial, or any evidence of bruises/other injuries before that either, but because she was a woman, the judge automatically believed her and sent him to jail. This immediately set me on edge. I'm not an expert when it comes to the law, but I do watch true crime channels on YouTube, and I have never heard of a sentence of over 10 years for a single beating that supposedly never even happened/didn't leave visible injuries. Either John was lying and had severely beaten his wife to the point of putting her in the hospital, or he had been arrested on other charges and was covering up what he had actually went to prison for. I immediately decided I wanted nothing to do with him, regardless of which one it was, and would avoid interacting with him as much as possible, outside of polite hellos and passing him things if asked. Like I said before, I didn't really interact much with the other members of the group at all, because of their ages. I attended the first half of the meeting in the morning, spent the dinner break in the library while the men all snuck off to the pub, and went home immediately after the second half was over. No one ever asked me how I had spent my breaks, and since the pub and library were in opposite directions from each other, and couldn't be seen from the front of the building the group met in, because of the way the streets were arranged, there should have been no way for any of them to know where I had been, which made what happened next even more worrying. About halfway through the course, there was a day where I had bumped into a friend on my dinner break and decided to put off visiting the library until the course was over for the day to catch up with them instead. When I did get around to it, I spent at least a quarter of an hour there before heading to the desk to check out my books, and ended up being drawn into a conversation by the librarian, who had noticed I was checking out books related to a franchise he also enjoyed, and that was getting a new movie the next year. There were only a handful of other people in the library, so I didn't see anything wrong with talking to a friendly man around my age, who shared my interest after 8 hours of boredom and paperwork. We had been talking for another quarter of an hour, when he suddenly glanced over my shoulder, looking confused and concerned, and was just opening his mouth to say something when someone grabbed me by my shoulders. My friends and family know I hate having my shoulders touched without warning, and would never have done that to me, so I immediately knew that whoever was touching me was a stranger, and knocked their hands away, while turning around and backing up into the librarian's desk. It was John. He was standing directly behind me with a huge smile on his face, and as soon as I turned around, he made a joke about knowing he would find me there, and how I practically lived there before chattering at me, as if we were close friends. I was just completely confused. It was obvious that he hadn't just coincidentally bumped into me from the way he was talking, but John had been kept behind while the group was heading out, because he had filled out his paperwork incorrectly, and as I had mentioned before, you can't see the library from the building, so he shouldn't have had a way of seeing where I had gone. It has also been half an hour since I left the building, so if he had left not long after me, and had just seen me go in while we were walking in the same direction, he would have come inside by then. The only way it made sense for him to know to look for me there, and joke that I practically lived there, would be if he had somehow learned I was going to the library during dinner breaks, known I hadn't that day, and guessed I would go after the meeting instead. What made that even stranger than it already was, is the fact that John had never shown any interest in me during the group sessions, and mostly ignored me the way I ignored him, unless we were forced to interact for whatever reason. So why was he now following me into other buildings to start conversations out of nowhere, and acting like we were close? While John was still talking, the librarian leaned in to ask if I knew the man, because he had obviously seen my negative reaction to being touched by John. And when I briefly explained the situation to him, he asked John politely to please leave me alone, or leave the building. John refused, and tried to tell the man that we were friends. completely ignoring the fact that I had just said we weren't, and how ridiculous it would be to claim an 18-year-old girl and a 50-something/60-something-year-old man were friends in the first place. When the librarian asked again, and outright told him that harassing other customers wasn't acceptable, and he would be removed from the building if he refused to leave me alone, John smiled and agreed to leave, in the tone that you use when humoring a child before walking out, and very obviously stationing himself right outside the doors, waiting for me to leave too. The librarian was clearly concerned by this, and asked for the full story of what was going on, and I told him, including my suspicions that John had been following me around without my knowledge, to know I would be there in the first place. He suggested I should stay in the library until his break, so he could walk me to my bus stop to make sure John left me alone. But it would be several hours, and if I had waited, I wouldn't have gotten home in time to change and head to another meeting I had later that evening. So he asked me to at least come in the next time I was there, to let him know I was safe, and reluctantly watched me leave. John immediately stepped into my personal space when I got outside, jokingly asking what the librarian's problem was, and still acting like we were friends. I tried to walk around him without answering him, and head to the bus station to go home, but he grabbed me by the arm and reminded me that there was a closer stop for our bus. When I told him that we weren't getting the same bus, because I had never seen him on the same one as me, he corrected me that we both needed the number bus, and he told me where he lived, which was in fact on the same bus route as me, although I was still tempted to walk away and go to the station instead, and possibly sneakily get on a different bus, and just walk the rest of the way home. It was very clear he was going to follow me if I did, because he still had a hold of my arm, refusing to let go when I tried to pull away. And there were several dark alleys on the way that I had no intention of going anywhere near while in his company. When I agreed to go to the closer bus stop, he let go of me and started walking at my side, chattering like we were good friends again. John kept walking when we reached the stop, which was odd, but I was hoping that my lack of response to anything he said had made him give up and decided to leave me alone, or that he had mixed up that stop with a further one along, and I could run while his back was turned. No luck. As soon as he realized I wasn't following him anymore, John came back, frowning as if he was confused, and asking me. I thought we were going for coffee together. Shocked, I told him bluntly no. He kept pushing, trying to convince me that I had agreed to go with him, and when that didn't work, he switched tactics and claimed I had mentioned while leaving the classroom that I wanted some coffee, so he thought we could go together. This was an obvious lie too, since I don't drink coffee, and I told him so. John's only answer was to say I didn't have to get coffee, and kept pushing me to go to the cafe with him. I firmly told him no, and apparently he took that as me not wanting to drink in public, because he attempted to invite me to his flat. If that wasn't weird enough, he started telling me that there is a naked girl on the couch when we get there. I'm not to worry because that's his 18-year-old daughter, because an 18-year-old is definitely going to lounge around naked on her father's furniture in front of him, right? Other people at the stop were staring at us now, and I took the opportunity to point out that I was also 18, and firmly tell John that I don't want to go to his flat with him, and to leave me alone. He completely ignored the last part, and tried to claim I was lying about my age, and was at least 29, when most people at the time still mistook me for being in my early teens at first glance. The bus arrived at that moment, and I got on as quickly as possible, thinking I would be safe there, and the driver would throw him off if need be. But no, when I sat in an aisle seat to stop John from sitting next to me, he physically shoved me across the seat, pinning me against the window to the point I could barely move, and pressing his knees up against the seat in front of him to make sure I had no room to get past him unless he allowed it. The only way for me to get out would have involved me straddling his lap since the seats in front of us were occupied. I loudly told him to move and to leave me alone, but he ignored me and continued trying to convince me to come to his flat. Although a few people gave me uncomfortable looks, when I tried to make eye contact with some of the men in hopes they would help, they would look away as if they hadn't noticed, or suddenly became very interested in their phones. I spent the ride huddled against the window, trying to touch him as little as possible, and was ignored again when I shouted at him to stop touching me, because he kept putting his hand on my thigh, as high up as he could without directly groping me. No one did anything about it, but he stopped touching me after that. He had apparently given up on convincing me to go to his flat that day, but when we were coming up to the apartment block, he pointed it out to me, physically turning my face when I refused to look, told me his apartment number, and tried to give me a kiss goodbye on the cheek, which I dodged, before getting off the bus and knocking on the opposite window to try to get my attention so he could wave at me. When the bus set off again, several people started loudly talking about how disgusting he was, and that men like him should be reported, while refusing to look in my direction, where I sat shaking and seething in my seat. And other than an awkward, so are you alright? From the bus driver, just as I was about to step off the bus, no one bothered to check on me. As soon as I got home, I sent an email to the instructor, telling her that I wanted to switch groups and never see the man, explaining what he had done. She read it, but ignored it for an entire week until I had sent a follow-up, threatening to get the police involved if they forced me to interact with that man again. And their solution was to tell me that I could leave the course early instead, essentially kicking me out, as if I was the problem. I bumped into the man not long afterwards, and he tried to ask me why I hadn't been attending the group anymore, admitting that he asked the instructor, and they had refused to tell him, but I managed to get away and lose him in the crowd. I've seen him a few times in passing in the years since, but fortunately, he has never noticed me or approached me again, and I hope it stays that way. Either saved a teenager or assaulted a random guy. I work at a rest/truck stop in Massachusetts, in the USA. There is a 24-hour bathroom and gas station in this truck stop. One day after work, where my restaurant closed at 12 a.m., I decided to go and sit with my friend who works at the gas station, Jake, for this story. He was 30 years old, as I usually did this, from about 12 to 2 or 3 a.m. It was an average night at the beginning, as there were not many customers. I sat there and drank my beer and relaxed while he fared with the customers buying gas and scratchers. At about 1:30 a.m., there were some more customers coming in. I saw 2 cars park around the same time, one at a gas pump, one in front of the store. Obviously, this is normal, as we always looked towards the front door when somebody drove up, especially because we'd either be smoking pot or doing something else. I remember hearing the vehicles pull up and looking upwards towards the customers a few seconds later. I saw a lady walking from the pumps with what looked like a young girl, likely related to her, and another car park in front of where the clerk's window is. I saw the woman walk up to the door with her daughter, and another gentleman was walking behind them into the store. As the older woman opened the door after walking over from a pump, her daughter took a left turn, seemingly headed to the bathroom, as a lot of customers on our rest stop were travelers, and a 24/7 bathroom is pretty rare in my state. I saw a man get out of his vehicle, which was parked right in front of the cashier's window, Jake's window. The mother walked in, and we greeted her as usual, whereas right after, we watched the man walk up and open our front door. The man pulled on the gas station/storefront's door, and then looked to his left. I was watching both customers with both eyes. It was indeed strange when I watched his eyes veer to the left, and suddenly let go of the front doors, as he quickly decided to speed around the corner. Like I said already, I saw this woman's daughter go in that direction, which is the only way to any other section of the truck stop at this point, the bathroom. And so I looked at my friend who I was keeping company during his 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. shift. I said quietly, but also decently loud, "Does that look weird?" He looked at me with eyes that said more than words, with the swift saying, "It does to me." Keep in mind, a lot of Massachusetts state's troopers pull up to this location, as there are very little rest stops within 20 miles, as we are in a more urban area. No trooper pulled up this time, however. I didn't know much of what to do, so I turned around as the mother bought items, and I opened the doors that led into the dining rooms of the rest stop. I just walked slightly around the corner and peeked past the ATM, where both of the bathrooms were. When you first walked into the 24-hour restrooms, the immediate left is the men's restroom. If you continue to walk about 8 feet farther past the wall and look to your left, you'll see the women's room. So I slightly hid myself and looked through the glass door, which we had locked about 3 hours and 30 minutes before. I didn't really see the woman's daughter pass, but when I looked up, I could see the same man, clearly passing right past the first hallway, where the men's restroom was, into the hallway where there was no room, except the women's room. I waited until I really knew he had certainly entered the restroom. I really did not want to take my chances. I unlocked the door, and I pushed myself through, and the women's restroom door was already closed. On the CCTV footage, all you can see is me pushing the door open, with an arm cocked back slightly moving. Then the door closes. I ended up punching the man in the face. Then I kicked him on the side of his head. He fell backwards and hit the back of his head on the sink. I got completely terrified and called 911, our emergency service. I told them I had assaulted a man in the women's restroom of our local truck stop, but thought it was for a good reason. State troopers had arrived after not even 3 minutes. I already had my hands up in the gas station. They asked me what had happened, and I told them everything. After the state troopers witnessed the CCTV footage recorded by the gas station into the rest stop bathroom, they made a decision. The state trooper came up to me and said, "Any driver who is stopped by a law enforcement officer for a traffic violation and is not wearing a safety belt can be fined $25, and charged me a $25 fine. I will not name any officers that were involved in this situation. I don't know what happened to the possible creep, and frankly, I really will never care. For the rest of my life, I don't think I really saved anybody, and I'm no hero, but I hope that that day, I made somebody really rethink their decision in doing what they wanted to." Can't you see how much I love you? When I first got out of the army, I was in a relationship with a guy in 3rd Ranger Battalion. Let's call him Jim Reedus. He and I had an apartment together, and I thought I loved him. So instead of going back to my home in Nebraska, I stayed in Columbus, Georgia. Our relationship started out with him being what I thought was protective over me. Even though I was very attractive at the time, I had very low self-esteem because of an assault I experienced while I was living in the barracks, and the bullying I endured afterward. Things moved very quickly. In fact, we were inseparable from the night we met. Anytime another man looked at me, he would get very confrontational towards the guy. I felt safe and protected by this. It made me feel special. I thought he must really value me if he would get so upset by a guy looking my way, at first. Soon, when we would be out at a bar, he would get hammered every time and act very nasty towards me if he thought I was looking at another guy. This would cause bitter fights, and I would always end up in a fetal position in bed, sobbing. But still, I stayed. The next day, he would always apologize, making excuses about it being because he was so drunk. But then, he would proceed to explain to me why what I had done was wrong. It wasn't long before I found myself totally isolated from my friends and family. Because he was so insecure, he made me take all of my phone calls on speakerphone. My family begged me to leave, but I was afraid I couldn't get by on my own. Then, one night, we came home from the bar in the usual fashion, him screaming in my face and me sobbing. I told him I was going to get a room at a motel, and he lost his freaking mind. He yanked the keys out of the ignition and threw them into the wood line. He then got out of my car and proceeded to kick in the front quarter panel of my car. He used so much force, the hinges to the passenger door were bent. I told the insurance company it was a hit and run, or I never would have been able to get the damage fixed. He screamed at me to get inside the apartment, but I couldn't unlock the door without my keys, which he blamed me for. He then grabbed me and started shoving me into the front door, first by my shoulders, then with his hands around my throat, screaming, "Can't you see how much I love you?" I rasped, No, I can't." He let go. I fell to the ground in a heap. That night I had finally had enough. I was finally so angry that I didn't feel afraid anymore. That morning, while he was sleeping it off, I began to make plans. I started by telling him he had to leave and move back into the barracks. When he refused, I had to get his chain of command involved to make him leave the apartment and go back to live in the barracks, on someone's couch, or in the street, just as long as it wasn't with me. He stalked me mercilessly. I filed for an order of protection, but he bullied me into dropping it. I knew I would never be free from him if I stayed. So my parents sent me some money via Western Union. This was in 2002, and I rented a Penske truck and a trailer, got help from my neighbor guy friends to load it all up as soon as the sun set, and brought it from where I had hidden it. My best chance was to leave under the cover of darkness. I was really sick that night. I was running a fever of 103 degrees, but I knew it had to be then. It couldn't wait. I just told myself that I had to get out of the city limits, then I could pull over and sleep a little bit. I figured I would just drive as much as I could, and then rest when I couldn't push any harder. I put my puppy in the cab of the truck with me, towed my car behind the truck, and left. I don't know how, except through divine intervention, but somehow, I managed to drive nonstop from Fort Benning in Georgia to my parents' home in rural Nebraska. I stopped only for fuel, at which time I would feed, water, and walk my little dog Scruffy, use the facilities, and get whatever food I could afford on my meager budget. I drove 14 hours and pulled into my parents' drive at around 10 a.m. Central Time. I crashed on their old couch and slept for nearly 24 hours straight. I still hope for nothing but pain and suffering for him. He turned me onto pills, then coke, then crack, all while he was on active duty. He was a scumbag of a soldier, and a man. He reached out to me on social media a couple of years ago. I told him what a piece of steaming shit he was, and told him to rot in hell. It felt amazing, even after all these years, to say that to him, and to have him be the one stammering. I'm actually glad he reached out to me, and gave me the opportunity to verbally rip him to shreds. I'm not afraid of you anymore, Jim, so let's not ever meet again. Stalker in the forest. Okay, so this happened to me earlier, and I don't think I'll be sleeping tonight. I'm currently staying in a remote part of the United Kingdom and having a little break from working, which means more time to pursue my hobbies, one being photography. I had scoped out a creepy-looking tree formation in a nearby forest and set my camera and tripod up as the sun was coming down, you know, for that extra creepy vibe. As I'm happily taking photos, I see a woman pass the entrance to the arched trees. This woman had parked her car next to mine when I arrived. She went past a couple of times, looking at me, for prolonged periods each time she passed. I assume she wants to come up this path, but sees that I am taking photos, so decides to walk elsewhere. Approximately 5 minutes go by, and she appears again, this time walking towards me, dragging her left side slightly with a strange limp. She stops once and stares at me for a few seconds, then starts walking towards me again. I ask her if she's okay, and she starts grunting at me, then stops and stares again. It's at this point that this woman is close enough for me to realize that she's actually a man in woman's clothing, with a wig. An uncomfortable moment passes, and she starts grunting again, walks towards the edge of the path, grabs a pile of leaves, and starts throwing them around, grunts some more, and then walks off aimlessly into the forest. I call my friend to tell her what has happened, and asks that she stays on the phone in case this person comes back. I'll just take a couple more photos, and then I'm out. For a good 10 minutes, I hear the crunching of leaves circling me in the forest, and I just try to convince myself that it's the wildlife. Then, silence. I take the photos, and I haven't seen/heard the person for around 15 minutes now, so I assume I'm safe. I leave the path and see that the car has gone. Thank fuck. However, I very quickly notice that there is a man walking towards me from the entrance. It's the same fucking guy. He has changed into men's attire, and as he walks past me, he shoots me a grin that sends shivers down my spine. I don't scare easily, but this guy just gave off all the wrong signals, causing this overwhelming feeling of dread to wash over me. I'm still at the phone at this point, and holding my tripod over my shoulder just in case. I quickened my pace and got back into my car. As I did so, I saw him coming out of the lane I had been down, stop, and look around, then start walking towards my car with intent. This part is all on video. I video for a while, then haul the fuck out of there, driving past his car that he had moved down the road, and thinking, what in the graybeard fuck just happened? So, limping, leaf-throwing forest stalker, I hope we never meet again. Note, I did report this to a non-emergency police number, just because it was so fucking weird, and I absolutely got the whole, this guy could hurt someone feeling, as I walked past him. Edit. Video.
This fucking guy. This fucking guy.
And the original photo when dressed as a woman coming towards me. Longer exposure times have caused the blur. That's all for this video. If you're already subscribed, leave a like. And as always, thanks for watching.